What happens when a country music superstar walks into the lion's den of daytime television and refuses to back down from one of the most outspoken hosts in media? Blake Shelton had been booked on The View to promote his latest album, What Should have been a routine publicity stop. But from the moment he settled into that hot seat, you could feel the tension crackling through the studio. The other hosts seemed ready for a typical celebrity chat. But Joy Behar had something entirely different in mind. So Blake, Joy began, her voice carrying that familiar edge. I have to ask about some of your recent social media activity. You've been pretty vocal about certain political topics, and frankly, some of us are wondering if country music stars should really be weighing in on complex issues they might not fully understand. The studio audience fell silent. This wasn't the softball question anyone expected. Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his famous Oklahoma charm remained intact. At least on the surface. Well, Joy, I appreciate the question, Blake responded, his voice measured but with a hint of steel underneath. But I think you might be confusing me with someone who needs permission to have opinions about my own country. Last I checked, being a musician doesn't disqualify someone from caring about the direction America is heading. Joy leaned forward, clearly not satisfied. But Blake, come on. When you have millions of followers hanging on your every word, don't you think there's a responsibility to stick to what you know best? I mean, you're from Oklahoma. Your perspective on national issues might be a bit, shall we say, limited? That comment landed like a bomb. You could see Blake's entire demeanor shift. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. Limited, Blake repeated, his voice dropping to a lower register. Joy, I need you to help me understand something here. Are you suggesting that because I'm from Oklahoma, because I represent the millions of Americans who live between the coasts, that my voice somehow matters less than yours? Whoopi Goldberg tried to jump in, sensing the interview spiraling. Now, Blake, I don't think that's what Joy meant. But Joy cut her off. What I'm saying, Blake, is that when celebrities start spouting off about politics, especially when they're appealing to certain demographics, it can be dangerous. We've seen what happens when people in your position influence voters who might not have all the information. The other hosts exchanged nervous glances. This was exactly the kind of moment that could make or break careers, the kind of television people would talk about for months. Blake sat back in his chair, and for a moment, everyone thought he might just let it slide. Instead, he smiled. This was something else entirely. Joy, I want to make sure I understand your position here, Blake said, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that somehow felt more menacing than if he'd started yelling. You're sitting there on national television telling me that people from my part of the country, people who work with their hands, who serve in the military, who grow the food that feeds this nation, that these people are too stupid to make informed political decisions without celebrity guidance. Is that really the hill you want to die on today? The studio audience was completely silent now. Joy's face had gone slightly pale, but she wasn't backing down. That's not what I said, and you know it, she fired back. I'm talking about responsibility. When you have a platform, you have a duty to use it wisely. And frankly, some of the things you've posted lately suggest you might not be using yours very wisely at all. Blake stood up slowly from his chair. Not aggressively, but with the kind of deliberate movement that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. Now we're getting somewhere. Joy, you want to talk about using platforms responsibly? Let's talk about that. For the past hour before we went live, I sat in your green room and listened to you and your staff making jokes about flyover states, about truck drivers being uneducated. And now you want to lecture me about responsibility? Joy's eyes widened. She clearly hadn't expected Blake to call out what she thought were private conversations. Blake. I think you're mischaracterizing am I? Blake interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you think half the country is too dumb to have opinions that matter. And the really interesting thing, Joy, is that you're doing this on a show that's supposed to represent different viewpoints? Whoopi was frantically trying to regain control. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a quick commercial break. No, Blake said firmly, holding up his hand. We're not taking a break. Joy asked me a question, and I'm going to give her a complete answer, because unlike some people, when I say something, I stand behind it. Joy shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but her defiance remained intact. Blake, you're being dramatic. Nobody said anyone was too dumb for anything. We're talking about nuanced policy issues that require expertise. Expertise. Blake let out a laugh that had zero humor in it. Joy, what exactly makes you an expert on the lives of working Americans? When's the last time you pumped your own gas, worried about making rent, or had to choose between buying groceries and filling a prescription? Because the people you're dismissing as uninformed, they live that reality every single day. Sarah N. tried to redirect the conversation. Blake, we all appreciate different perspectives, but maybe we can find some common ground here. Blake turned to her, his expression softening slightly. Sarah, I respect what you're trying to do, but there's no common ground with someone who thinks my friends and family back home are second-class citizens when it comes to having political opinions. Joy's face was getting redder by the minute. That is absolutely not what I said, and you're putting words in my mouth. Then. Let's talk about what you did say, Blake shot back, his voice gaining momentum. You said people in my position shouldn't influence voters who might not have all the information. You said my perspective might be limited because I'm from Oklahoma. You questioned whether country music stars should weigh in on complex issues they might not understand. The audience was completely captivated. This wasn't the usual View discussion where panelists talked past each other. This was a genuine confrontation between two completely different worldviews. And neither side was giving an inch. Joy leaned forward aggressively. You know what, Blake? Fine, let's talk specifics. You posted support for policies that would hurt the very people you claim to represent. You've endorsed candidates who vote against healthcare funding, against education funding, against infrastructure spending that would benefit rural communities. So, explain to me how that's helping your Oklahoma friends. Blake's eyes lit up with something that looked almost like excitement. Now we're having a real conversation. You want to talk policy? Let's talk policy. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever lived in a small town where the biggest employer shut down because of federal regulations that made sense in boardrooms but destroyed actual lives? Blake, that's oversimplifying, Joy said. Have you? Blake pressed, not letting her deflect. Have you ever watched a family farm that's been in the same family for 4 generations get foreclosed on because of policies designed by people who've never set foot on a farm? Have you ever seen a coal mining town become a ghost town because politicians in Washington decided those jobs didn't matter anymore? Joy's voice rose to match his intensity. Those jobs were killing people. Blake, coal mining. Dangerous factory work. These industries were literally killing workers and destroying the environment. Sometimes change is hard, but necessary. There it is, Blake exclaimed, pointing directly at Joy. Right there. You just proved my entire point. You're so comfortable sacrificing other people's livelihoods for policies you think are right, but you never have to live with the consequences. When those mines shut down, when those factories close, you don't see the suicide rates go up. You don't see the drug addiction that follows. You don't see families torn apart because there's no work for 100 miles in any direction. Asterisk Whoopi was desperately trying to maintain some semblance of control. Blake, Joy, let's bring the temperature down just a notch. Asterisk no, Whoopi, Blake said, never taking his eyes off Joy. She wanted to question my right to have political opinions. She wanted to suggest that people from my world don't understand complex issues. Well, here's a complex issue for you, Joy. How do you tell a 50-year-old coal miner with a high school education and a mortgage that his job needed to disappear for the greater good, but also tell him he's too unsophisticated to understand the politics behind it? Asterisk's Joy was clearly frustrated now, her usual quick wit seeming to fail her. Blake, you're creating false dichotomies. We can support transition programs, retraining, economic development. Asterisk Blake laughed again, and this time it was genuinely incredulous. Transition programs, retraining. Joy, do you hear yourself? You're talking about people's entire identities, their family traditions, their communities, like they're just economic units that can be reprogrammed. A 45-year-old welder doesn't want to learn computer coding. He wants to weld. That's not ignorance. That's human dignity. Asterisk, the other panelists were looking back and forth between Blake and Joy like they were watching a tennis match. But this wasn't entertainment anymore. This was getting deeply personal, and everyone could feel it. Asterisk Joy's voice took on a sharper edge. So, what's your solution, Blake? Keep propping up dying industries forever. Ignore climate change? Attend. The world isn't changing. Asterisk, my solution. Blake stood up again, this time moving closer to the panel table. My solution is to stop treating working-class Americans like obstacles to progress and start treating them like human beings whose opinions and experiences matter. My solution is to stop assuming that everyone who disagrees with your politics is either stupid or evil. Nobody said anyone was evil, Joy protested. Blake's voice dropped to almost a whisper, but somehow it carried more power than when he was shouting. Joy, 20 minutes ago, you suggested that people who listen to my music might be too uninformed to make good voting decisions. You questioned whether I should even be allowed to express political opinions because of where I'm from and what I do for a living. If that's not calling us evil, it's definitely calling us inferior. Asterisk, the studio was so quiet you could hear the cameras were. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but for perhaps the first time in View history, she seemed to be at a complete loss for words. Asterisk Blake looked around the table at each of the hosts, then back to Joy. You know what the really sad part is, Joy? I came here today hoping to have a conversation. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could find some understanding between people who see the world differently. But instead, I walked into the exact kind of coastal elite bubble that makes millions of Americans feel like their voices don't matter. Asterisk Joy finally found her voice again, and it came out sharper than ever. Coastal elite bubble. Blake, I grew up in Brooklyn. My father was a truck driver. Don't you dare lecture me about working class values. Asterisk, then what happened to you? Blake shot back immediately. Because the Joy sitting across from me right now just spent the last 10 minutes explaining why truck drivers and coal miners and farmers are too simple to understand politics. Your father would be ashamed of what you just said about people, exactly. Like him, asterisk, the gasp from the studio audience was audible. Even Whoopi looked stunned at how personal this had become. Joy's face went through several different emotions before settling on pure fury. Asterisk, how dare you bring my father into this? Joy's voice cracked slightly. You don't know anything about my family or my background. Blake's response was quieter, but somehow more devastating. Asterisk, you're right. Joy, I don't know your father, but I know mine. And I know that he taught me to respect people regardless of their education level or their zip code. He taught me that. The guy who fixes your car knows things you don't know. And the woman who teaches your kids has wisdom you need to hear. And the farmer who grows your food understands the land in ways you never will. Asterisk, he paused, looking directly into the camera. For the first time since the confrontation began. And most importantly, he taught me that in America, everyone gets a voice. Not just the people who agree with you, not just the people who went to the right schools or live in the right neighborhoods. Everyone. Asterisk's Joy was struggling to regain her composure. Blake, that's a beautiful sentiment. But when people use their voices to support policies that hurt themselves and others, someone has to point out the contradictions. Asterisk, there it is again, Blake exclaimed, his voice rising to its highest level. Someone has to point out the contradictions. Who made you the teacher? Joy? Who decided that you get to grade everyone else's political opinions? The arrogance is just breathtaking. Asterisk Sonny Hostin made one more desperate attempt to mediate. Maybe we can agree that everyone deserves respect in political discourse. Asterisk, no, Sonny, Blake interrupted, his eyes never leaving Joy. We can't agree on that because Joy doesn't believe it. She thinks respect is something you earn by having the right opinions, not something you deserve for being human. Asterisk Joy slammed, her hand on the table, making everyone jump. You are putting words in my mouth that I never said. Asterisk Blake's response was immediate and thunderous. Then tell me right now on national television that a truck driver from Oklahoma has just as much right to his political opinions as you do. Tell me that his vote counts just as much as yours. Tell me that his life experience is just as valid as yours, even if it leads him to different conclusions. Asterisk, the studio fell completely silent. Joy opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked around the table at her co-hosts, then back at Blake. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Asterisk of Course everyone's vote counts the same, she finally said. But her voice lacked conviction. Asterisk, that's not what I asked you, Blake pressed. I asked if his opinions are just as valid as yours, if his life experience matters just as much, if he has just as much right to influence political discourse as you do. Asterisk Joy's hesitation was everything. In that pause, in that moment of uncertainty, Blake had won the argument more decisively than if she'd given him a direct answer. Asterisk, Whoopi finally managed to break the tension. We're going to have to wrap this up, Blake. Any final thoughts? Asterisk, Blake looked around the studio one more time, then back at the camera. My final thought is this. America works best when we listen to each other, not when we lecture each other. When we respect each other, not when we dismiss each other. And when we remember that wisdom doesn't come from where you live or what degrees you have. It comes from paying attention to life and caring about other people. Asterisk, he stood up and extended his hand to Joy. For a moment, it looked like she might not take it. Then, perhaps realizing how it would look on television, she shook his hand briefly. Asterisk Joy, I hope someday you'll visit Oklahoma, Blake said as he released her hand. Not for a photo op or a political stunt, but just to meet some of the people you've been talking about today. I think you might be surprised by how much they could teach you. Asterisk Joy's response was barely audible. Maybe I will. Asterisk Blake nodded to the other hosts, then looked directly into the camera one final time. And to everyone watching at home, remember this. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. Your vote matters. Don't let anyone, anywhere, tell you otherwise. Asterisk, as the show went to commercial break, Blake walked off the set, leaving behind a panel of hosts who looked like they had just witnessed something they weren't sure they fully understood. The studio audience sat in stunned silence. Processing what they had just seen, it was television that would be talked about for years. To come the kind of raw, unscripted moment that reminded everyone why live television could be so powerful and so dangerous at the same time.